Dusk dragged itself across the frontier like a tired animal, low and gray, the wind worrying at the dry grass until it hissed. The road that cut past the ranch was empty. No wagons, no riders, just ruts hardened by neglect and the promise of night. That was when she appeared, standing where the fence met the road, clutching a bundle that looked heavier than it ought to be. Not because of what it held, but because of what it meant. She was obese, exhausted, and trembling in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Her dress was stained with dust and sweat, the fabric stretched thin and mended poorly, the kind of garment that carried the memory of hands that had shoved her aside. Her shoes were worn through at the toes. Her face bore the quiet bruises of mockery. Eyes trained downward, shoulders pulled inward, as if she had learned that taking up less space might keep her safer. Town had made its judgment and sent her on her way. Behind her, the sky bled orange into purple. Ahead of her stood the ranch, lonely, wind-scoured, its fence leaning like it had grown tired of standing guard. The gate creaked when she touched it, and she flinched, as if even the sound might accuse her of trespass. The cowboy came out of the barn with a coil of rope over his shoulder. He was built for silence. Broad, weathered, his hat pulled low enough to shade eyes that had seen too much to waste words. He stopped when he saw her. Long enough to take in the bundle. Long enough to decide he didn't want trouble. "You can't stay," he said. Not unkind. Not gentle. Just true, the way the land taught men to speak. She nodded too quickly. "I know." Her voice caught. She swallowed it down and tried again. "I'll go. She looked at the darkening road, the empty miles, the night that would swallow her whole. Hunger twisted her face. Shame followed, hot and bright. He shifted his weight. The wind pushed between them, carrying the smell of dust and old hay. He had reasons. Everyone did. Mercy was a thing you paid for later. She took a breath that scraped her chest raw. "Please," she said, and the word fell apart in the air. Then, as if she feared silence more than refusal, she added the last thing she had left to offer. "Please let me stay. I can cook." The rope slid from his shoulder and hit the dirt with a dull thud. He didn't answer right away. He didn't look away either. The sky dimmed another shade. Somewhere a coyote called. The gate stood between them, open just enough to matter. The cowboy stepped aside and let her pass, not with welcome, but with a warning measured in silence. The cabin door shut behind them, settling with a tired groan. Heat from the hearth rolled out in slow waves, thick with smoke and old memories. He pointed once, no lingering, no explanation, toward a stool near the fire. Rules didn't need speeches out here. They lived in the way a man stood between you and the door. She moved like the floor might give way beneath her. Careful steps. Hands folded tight. Eyes never quite lifting. Shame clung to her coat as surely as the cold had moments before. She hovered near the warmth, afraid to claim it. Afraid that claiming anything might cost her everything. When the kettle hissed, she flinched. When the fire popped, she steadied herself. Every sound felt like a test she didn't know she was taking. He watched without staring. That was his way. Years of living alone had sharpened his sense for trouble, taught him how fear announces itself before it speaks. He set boundaries with small gestures. Boots by the door, rifle on the rack, the table kept clear. "One night," he said at last, voice low, the words clipped clean. "You eat. You sleep. You leave at dawn." It wasn't cruelty. It was distance built plank by plank to keep loss from walking back in. She nodded too fast. Gratitude rushed out of her in apologies she swallowed before they could spill. When he poured a bowl and slid it across the table, she waited until he turned away to lift the spoon. Ate quiet. Ate grateful. Ate like tomorrow was already a rumor. He pretended not to notice how her hands shook, how she paused between bites as if bracing for a door to open. The night pressed closer. Wind worried the eaves. Shadows stretched and shrank as the fire burned down. They shared the room without sharing space, two lives held in suspension. Not safe. Not sent away. Just contained. When the lamp dimmed, neither moved. Morning would decide the rest. And both of them knew it. The first real change came with food. Not the kind scraped together out of necessity, but meals that lingered, slow-cooked, seasoned, remembered. The woman moved around the small kitchen like she was stepping through memory, careful but certain. She chopped vegetables with practiced hands, stirred pots that hadn't been used in months, filled the cabin with a smell the cowboy hadn't realized he'd been missing. Warmth returned not just to the room but to the hours themselves. Morning felt less sharp. Evening less empty. He watched her work without comment. The clink of a spoon against iron. The low hiss of fat in a pan. Those sounds softened something in him. They spoke of routine, of days that didn't revolve around endurance alone. He found himself sitting at the table longer than needed, eating slower than hunger required. Not because the food was rare, but because the quiet felt earned. She spoke while she cooked. Not all at once. Never directly. Bits and pieces slipped out like steam. A childhood spent being laughed at. Doors closed before she ever reached them. Work taken away the moment someone decided she was too much trouble to look at. They said I ate more than I earned, she murmured once, eyes fixed on the stove. Another time, I learned to move slow so folks wouldn't notice me. No anger in her voice. Just fact. Like hunger had taught her to expect less. The cowboy said nothing, but memory filled the space between them. He remembered another woman in that kitchen once. Lighter footsteps. Laughter that used to echo off the walls. He remembered the sickness. The long nights. The way the house had gone silent after the ground closed over her. Since then he'd learned how to live lean. No excess. No attachment. You couldn't lose what you didn't keep. And yet here he was. Plates washed, shelves restocked. A fire kept going longer than necessary. One night, as wind pressed against the windows, she asked him why he stayed so far from town. He hesitated, then answered simply, "Too many ghosts." She nodded. She understood ghosts. There were things she didn't say, but the way her hands trembled when riders passed the fence said enough. The way she flinched at certain voices carried in the wind. Once, while clearing the table, she paused and whispered, "They didn't just mock me. Some of them like seeing me beg." Her eyes lifted just long enough to meet his. Power does that. That was when he understood. This wasn't just cruelty born of ignorance. Someone in town had enjoyed her hunger. Had used it. The cabin grew quieter after that. He checked the lock twice before bed. She set aside extra bread without being asked. Hunger had hidden many things. Shame. Fear. Memory. But in that shared space between firelight and full plates, it also revealed something else. Belonging. The sound of hooves reached the ranch before the riders did, slow, deliberate, meant to be heard. Dust rose along the fence line, curling in the late afternoon light like a warning that refused to hurry. The cowboy stood in the yard, one hand resting on the post, watching as 3 men from town reined in just short of the gate. He recognized them at once. Not friends. Not quite enemies. The kind of men who carried the town's judgment on their backs and called it order. "We heard you picked up some trouble," one of them said, eyes already sliding past the cowboy toward the cabin. His gaze lingered there too long. "A girl. Big one. Folks say she's been causing problems." The cowboy didn't answer right away. Silence had always unsettled men like this more than threats ever could. "She ain't trouble," he finally said. "She's eating. Sleeping. That's all." The men exchanged looks, smirks creeping in like rot. "That kind don't stay quiet," another replied. "Doesn't belong nowhere. Town's had enough of carrying dead weight. Thought you'd understand your place better than this." Inside the cabin, the woman froze. She hadn't meant to listen, but their voices carried easily through the thin walls. Dead weight. Doesn't belong. Words she'd worn like chains most of her life. Her hands trembled as she set the pot down. She knew how this went. Knew how mercy turned into inconvenience, then into danger. By the time the riders left, her decision was already forming. She began gathering her things before dusk. The cowboy found her at the table, bundle tied tight, eyes fixed on the floor. "I'll go," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to cause trouble. I never do." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned back toward the window, toward the fence line where the dust was still settling. "They don't get to decide that," he said. His voice was low, firm. "Not anymore." She searched his face, waiting for the doubt. It didn't come. Outside, the prairie stretched wide and unforgiving. Inside, for the first time, someone had chosen to stand. The wind shifted that evening, carrying more than dust across the plains. The cowboy felt it in his bones, the way old soldiers feel a battle before the first shot. Trouble had been sniffing around his fence line for days now, and Mercy had a way of drawing attention. He moved with quiet purpose, checking the rifle by the door, counting cartridges by feel alone. Boards were dragged across windows, nails driven deep with steady practice strikes. This wasn't panic. This was preparation. She watched from the table at first, hands folded, shoulders tight. The cabin had never felt like hers, not truly. Just a place she was allowed to exist in for now. When she finally stood, the chair scraped loud against the floor, and he turned, half expecting fear in her eyes. "I can help," she said. He looked at her then. Really looked. The exhaustion clung to her, yes, but so did resolve. He handed her a lantern without a word. She took it carefully, as if it were something precious, and followed him into the cold night. They worked in silence at first. She stacked firewood closer to the door so he wouldn't have to step out during a fight. She inventoried what little food they had, stretching it, planning meals the way someone who had known hunger learned to do. When her breath came heavy, she rested only long enough to steady it, then went back to work. No complaints. No apologies. At one point, a board slipped from his hands and nearly crushed his foot. She reacted faster than he did, grabbing the edge and hauling it clear with a grunt of effort that surprised them both. He met her eyes then, something shifting between them. "Thank you," he said. It was the first time he'd spoken her name without distance in his voice. Later she cooked. Not just to eat, but to remind the cabin what warmth felt like. The smell filled the space, pushing back the tension inch by inch. They sat across from each other, steam rising between them, and for a moment the world outside didn't exist. She laughed at something small. Burnt bread, maybe? And the sound startled them both. It had been a long time since laughter lived in that room. When the meal was done, they stood side by side at the window, watching the dark settle in. Two figures framed by lantern light. Not protector and burden anymore. Partners. That night, as the fire crackled low, the choice had been made. Not spoken but solid as iron. She was staying. And whatever came riding out of the dark, they would face it together. They came just after sunrise. The dust rose first, thin, deliberate, carried on hooves that didn't hurry because they didn't have to. The land recognized that sound. So did the cowboy. He stood on the porch with the rifle resting easy in his hands, eyes narrowed, jaw set. He'd been waiting since before dawn. Waiting had always been part of surviving. 3 riders slowed at the edge of the clearing. A 4th circled wide, testing angles, testing fear. Their coats were clean. Their faces weren't. Men like that never thought of themselves as cruel. They thought of themselves as correct. "She don't belong here," the lead rider called. His voice carried easy, practiced. "Town's been patient. Time to set things right." Behind the cowboy, inside the cabin, the woman stood still. She'd heard the tone before. Heard it when doors closed. When laughter followed her down the street. When worth was decided without asking her name. Her hands trembled, but she didn't hide them. "She stays," the cowboy said. Silence followed. Then laughter. Short. Sharp. "You planning to die for her?" another rider asked. "For that." The word hit harder than the cold ever had. The first shot came without warning. Wood splintered near the porch rail. The cowboy moved as the report echoed, dropping low, firing once in return. A rider screamed. A horse reared. Dust turned violent. The siege had begun. Gunfire cracked across the clearing, sharp and fast, echoing off the hills. The cabin shook as rounds tore into the walls. Inside, the woman moved. Not panicked, not frozen. She dragged the table into position like they'd planned. That cabin was no bargain. It was a trap. And now it had teeth. The cowboy fired from the window slit, measured, ruthless. He'd faced men before. Faced worse. But this time the weight was different. Every shot he took was a choice. Every breath a line drawn for someone the world had already thrown away. A bullet punched through the wall, grazing his arm. Blood bloomed dark against his sleeve. He grunted, pressed on. Outside, the riders advanced, using barrels and trees for cover, shouting insults meant to cut deeper than lead. "Look at her," one yelled. "Think she's worth this?" The woman heard that too. She stepped forward before the cowboy could stop her. The door burst open. Cold air rushed in. Smoke followed. I am, she said. Her voice didn't shake. The riders froze, confused, startled. They hadn't expected defiance. They never did. They expected tears. Begging. Retreat. You think cooking a few meals makes you equal? The lead man sneered. No, she said. But standing does. A shot rang out. The cowboy went down hard, the impact knocking the wind from him. Pain flared white. The world tilted. Without thinking, the woman grabbed the rifle he'd set aside. Her hands remembered every instruction. She fired once, clean, precise. The man who'd pulled the trigger fell backward into the dust, stunned more than dead, scrambling to crawl. The clearing erupted again. The remaining riders panicked now. Judgment had come riding confident. It was leaving wounded. The cowboy forced himself up, leaning against the wall, blood dripping to the floor. He looked at her, really looked, and saw something the town never had. Not weakness. Not apology. Resolve. They fought back to back as the siege collapsed. One rider fled. Another dropped his weapon and ran. The last stood shaking, eyes wide, finally seeing her not as a burden, but as a force. This ain't over, he spat. The cowboy raised his rifle. It is for you. The man bolted. When the dust finally settled, the clearing lay quiet. Smoke drifted. Birds returned cautious. The land watched, unmoved as it always did. The woman lowered the rifle slowly. Her breath came hard. Her knees trembled, but she didn't fall. The cowboy reached for her shoulder, steadying both of them. You didn't have to do that. Yes, she said softly. I did. They stood there together as the morning light spilled across the dirt. Judgment had come riding. And for the first time it had been answered. The dust settled the way it always did, slow, reluctant, as if the land itself needed a moment to decide what it had just witnessed. The riders were gone now. Their threats had scattered with them, carried off by the wind that whispered through the fence posts. Silence returned, heavy but different. Not empty. Earned. Rain came before dawn. Not a storm, just a steady, patient fall that darkened the earth and washed the grit from the porch boards. It traced clean lines through the dust, erased boot prints, softened the scars of the night. The cabin breathed again. The land forgave the only way it ever did, by continuing on. She stood at the doorway and watched the rain with her hands at her sides, no longer folded in apology. Her shoulders were squared now. The fear that had followed her from town to town had loosened its grip. She hadn't begged. She hadn't run. When judgment came riding, she stayed. That mattered. Out here, staying was its own kind of courage. Inside, the cowboy set the rifles back in their places and closed the door against the damp morning. He looked at her. Not with caution this time, not with pity, but with a quiet recognition. Strength didn't always come with sharp edges or hard hands. Sometimes it came with patience. With a warm meal set down at the right moment. With the will to stand where the world said you didn't belong. You can stay, he said, not as permission but as acknowledgement. She nodded once. No tears. No words. None were needed. The fire crackled low as daylight crept in, pale and clean. The table was full. The cabin felt larger than it ever had. And in that small, hard-won piece, two lives found something they hadn't known how to ask for. A place earned not by judgment but by choice. Out on the frontier, worth was decided fast and often wrong. People were measured by what they could offer, how they looked, how useful they seemed when times were hard. Those who didn't fit were pushed into the dark and told to make peace with it. Shelter was earned. Dignity was rationed. Belonging was rare. But the land never wrote those rules. People did. That girl believed she had to beg for a place by offering what little she thought she was worth. The cowboy believed loneliness was safer than judgment. And yet, when the moment came, they both defied what the frontier demanded of them. He opened his door. She stood her ground. And together they proved that usefulness is not the same as value. So I'll leave you with this, traveler. Who decides who belongs? Is it the crowd that sneers? Or the quiet soul who chooses to stay when turning away would be easier? If it had been your door, your fire, your night closing in, what would you have done? If this story found a place in you, leave your thoughts below, where voices still matter. And if you wish to keep walking these hard, honest frontier roads with us, through stories of justice, mercy, and chosen family, then subscribe and stay a while. The fire burns steady now. the table is full. And for the first time, neither of them faces the night alone.